The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. His gaze was steady, as if he'd already seen the fate of Bitter Creek Ranch before she even stepped onto the crumbling porch. He studied her with the slow, deliberate caution of someone who knew this land too well, who knew its secrets. Her heart slammed against her chest as she stood there, wind biting at her face, her coat flapping uselessly against the cold. "You're the one who inherited this place," he said, and for a moment, the weight of his words felt heavier than the land itself. He didn't ask. He simply stated it like a fact, one that felt like a death sentence. She had come this far. Was it even possible to survive here? Or was she already too late? Eleanor Nell Hartley didn't know much about ranching, and she knew even less about surviving in a place like this. She had spent her whole 26 years in Philadelphia, surrounded by stone buildings, the sound of horse-drawn carts on cobblestone streets, and the thick smell of industry. The wind didn't cut through the streets there. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. People didn't stare at you like you didn't belong. But here, standing on the sagging porch of a house that looked like it might collapse with the next gust, she felt it. She didn't belong. The telegram had come 3 weeks ago, and it had changed everything. Her uncle, the last of her family, had died suddenly, leaving her the last remaining piece of a broken legacy. Bitter Creek Ranch, a place that was more ruin than home. The inheritance wasn't much, but it was all she had left. The stagecoach ride here had been rough, jostling her against the wooden frame until her head felt like it was going to crack open. But she hadn't complained. Complaints took energy, and energy was something she had run out of. When the driver had called out Red Hollow, Nell had looked out of the grimy window to see a valley that stretched wide and empty. Brown grass swayed in the wind, and the sky looked heavy, like it was waiting for something to break. The land was barren, its promises forgotten. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. The man across from her had smelled of whiskey and dust, watching her like she was some kind of curiosity that would soon turn into a warning story. Red Hollow wasn't much. A muddy street, a handful of tired buildings, all huddled against the relentless wind. The town wasn't curious about her arrival. It was calculating. Everyone knew the ranch she had inherited was already as good as dead. The lawyer, Mr. Dobson, wasted no time in telling her just how bad things were. The numbers told a story Nell already knew. Bitter Creek Ranch was drowning in debt. The land was sick, the cattle dying off, the house sagging like an old man bent over with age. Mr. Dobson was clear. If she wanted to survive, she would need to sign everything over to the bank. If she stayed, the valley would finish what it started. But Nell had already made up her mind. She wasn't ready to walk away just yet. She asked to see the property. The wagon ride out to the ranch was short, but long enough for Nell to feel the weight of her decision press against her chest. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. When they crested the last rise, Bitter Creek Ranch lay before her like a broken monument to failure. The house sagged inward, and the barn was barely standing. The fence posts leaned, some almost falling over entirely. There were cattle, but too few of them, too thin, huddled near a watering hole that looked more like a puddle. The air smelled of decay. Mr. Dobson didn't need to say anything more. "That's it," he said, flat and final. He didn't need to. Nell could see it. But she stayed. As night fell, she spread her coat on the cold wooden floor of the house, under a roof that barely held together. She couldn't bring herself to go to bed. Instead, she lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the wind scream through the cracks in the walls. She told herself she wasn't afraid, but fear was quiet, and it was already there, creeping into the corners of her mind. The next morning, the sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road woke her. Cole Mercer was the first person she saw. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. Her nearest neighbor, a quiet cowboy, sat atop his horse, watching her with those calm eyes that seemed to already know everything about this place. "If you stay here, you're going to die," he said. No warning, no anger, just a simple fact. The land didn't care whether she lived or died. Nell swallowed hard. This was the first man to look at her ranch and say out loud what everyone else was thinking. She had come here to try, to fight for a place she couldn't even claim as her own yet. The town, the land, even the man next door, They all seemed to have written her off, but in her chest, something started to change. Maybe she wasn't here to survive. Maybe she was here to prove that this land wouldn't be the end of her. Later that day, the lawyer returned, bringing papers already prepared for her to sign. He had the quiet confidence of someone who knew how these stories ended. He explained, again, how signing would relieve her of the ranch's debts, how it would offer her an easy way out. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her, but Nell asked to see the ranch once more, despite already knowing what the number said. She didn't want easy. She wanted to see it again, because something deep inside told her this wasn't over yet. When Mr. Dobson left, she stood alone on the porch, her heart heavy with the decision ahead. The sound of hooves drew her attention. Cole Mercer had returned, unloading hay for the cattle, his first offering of help. He didn't smile. He didn't say much. He just worked. And Nell watched. She watched the cattle crowd toward him, hungry but willing. She watched him move with the kind of steady calm she hadn't yet learned. And as the cattle ate, she realized something. She wasn't alone here anymore. The days that followed were a blur of work, silence, and the slow realization that staying here would cost her more than she could possibly know. But Nell had made her decision. It was made in the quietest, darkest corner of her heart. She wouldn't leave. She couldn't. If this place was to die, it would die fighting. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. Nell woke before dawn every day, her body aching before she even stood up. The cold always hit first, sharp and biting, the kind of cold that sunk deep into the bones and made every movement feel like it was happening in slow motion. She'd shovel snow from the steps, pump water from the well until her hands bled, and then, only then, would she sit and try to make the house feel like something more than a decaying shell. Her uncle's old coat still hung on a hook by the door. It smelled of must and stale wood, but it was the only thing she had to remind her of the man who had fought for this ranch before he had died here alone. He had tried. And now it was her turn to try too. By noon, the ranch looked like it might still hold on, but by sundown the land had a way of making her question everything she was doing. That was when Cole appeared again. Nell had seen him watching from the ridge that morning, his horse standing like a shadow against the rising sun. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. She had never understood how someone could be so still, so calm in the face of such a fight. She was learning now. Cole Mercer never rushed. He just did what needed to be done. "Your cattle will need more feed in 3 days," he told her without greeting, unloading hay from his wagon with a steady rhythm. His face was unreadable as always, but the corners of his mouth twitched ever so slightly when he noticed the empty feed troughs. "I'll get it," Nell said. She wasn't sure where or how, but it didn't matter. Cole didn't respond. He didn't need to. He just turned his attention back to the cattle, watching them eat with a kind of quiet focus that seemed to take the edge off the harshness of the land. She couldn't help but stare at him. He was so different from anyone she had known, steady, unflinching, like the land itself. And something about the way he moved made her feel, for the first time since she'd arrived, like this place might be something she could stand on. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. She watched him work for hours, feeling the weight of her own helplessness shift. When he was finished, Cole turned to her. 3 days of feed," he said simply. "After that, they'll need more." He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and left, his presence lingering like the scent of smoke on the air. Nell didn't know whether to be angry or grateful. He wasn't offering her charity, and that made the help feel like something earned, not given. That night, she sat at the table, picking at a meal she had made with half the ingredients she'd had left. The house creaked around her, as if the walls themselves were telling her she was still a stranger here. The wind outside howled like a living thing, and inside, the fire flickered, barely enough to fight the chill. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away, piece by piece. But when she woke the next morning, It was to a sight that made her chest tighten in disbelief. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. The ground was still frozen from the night's storm, but the hay Cole had left for the cattle was scattered along the fence line, as if he'd been here in the dark, working without a sound. She stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter around her, and followed the trail. She found him, as usual, already at work. His hands were steady as he lifted hay and tossed it into the troughs, one after another. His movements were fluid, practiced, like they belonged to the land itself. "You didn't have to do this," she said, watching him from the gate. He didn't look up. "I don't like watching animals starve," he said, his voice low but not cold. Nell bit her lip, unsure of what to say. The thing was, he wasn't doing this out of some sense of duty. He wasn't helping because he had to. He was doing it because he could. And in that moment, Nell realized that she couldn't afford to be proud anymore. The ranch wasn't just her fight. It was a fight that took every hand it could get, even the quiet ones. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. "You need more supplies," Cole said, breaking the silence. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need to. He just went on, unloading the rest of the hay with the same silent efficiency. Nell watched him work, unsure of whether to feel indebted or empowered. She felt both. Later that afternoon, she went back inside to gather her thoughts. She had done the work, the hard work, but it still didn't feel like enough. The house was still falling apart, the cattle were still too thin, and the land was still trying to kill her slowly. But in the evening, after the sun had set, Cole returned again, this time with something else in his hands. A pot of stew. "Too much at my place," he said simply, handing it over to her without hesitation. Nell took it, her hands still raw from the work she'd been doing, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself a breath. The warmth from the stew seeped into her hands, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't alone. The quiet cowboy didn't ask for thanks. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. He didn't even look at her when he left. But something had shifted. She felt it in the air, like the first signs of rain. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something she couldn't name yet. But it was starting to feel like she might just belong here after all. Nell didn't sleep much that night. The wind had picked up again, howling like a beast outside the house, rattling the walls as if it wanted in. But it wasn't the storm that kept her awake. It was the feeling she couldn't shake, the creeping sense that this place had already broken her long before she had set foot on it. The cold air seemed to seep into her bones, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like a reminder of the house's age. Her hands still hurt from the work, but there was something in them now. Something that hadn't been there when she first arrived. She was learning to fight back. And no matter how hard it felt, she wasn't going to give in. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. The next morning, as she made her way to the barn to check on the cattle, she saw Cole's wagon from the corner of her eye. It was the same calm, purposeful presence as before. Only this time, he was carrying more than hay. He had a second wagon filled with supplies, more feed, tools, and something Nell couldn't quite place yet. It didn't take long to figure it out. Cole wasn't just helping out of pity. He wasn't rescuing her. He was preparing her. "You're going to need a lot more than this to get through the winter," he said, nodding toward the supplies. "You can't do this alone." His voice was steady, his face as unreadable as ever. Nell swallowed, trying to find the words. But she didn't have any. She was learning something. Slowly, there were no more lies. No more pretending she could do it on her own. She was going to have to accept help. And maybe, just maybe, she could offer something back. "I'll get it right," Nell said quietly. She wasn't sure who she was saying it to. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. But Cole nodded, the same quiet understanding in his eyes. For the next few days, Cole was gone, back to his own ranch, but Nell kept at it. The ranch needed constant attention, and she could feel herself slipping into a rhythm. The cattle were getting stronger, their coats starting to fill out a little. The barn, while still creaky, felt less like a death sentence and more like a home. But the work was never ending. The days blurred together. She spent hours fixing fences, feeding cattle, and cleaning out the barn, her hands blistering with each task. And every time she thought about stopping, Something in her chest tightened. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about something more. About finding a way to make this land work for her, not against her. And then the storm came. Nell had heard the rumors, but nothing could have prepared her for the ferocity of it. The wind screamed, louder than anything she'd ever experienced before. It rattled the windows and howled through the cracks in the barn. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. The sky darkened, the air thick, with the kind of weight that felt like the world was about to collapse. Nell huddled inside the house, waiting for it to pass. But the storm didn't pass. It just kept coming. The next morning, when the wind died down, Nell stepped outside to find that the worst had happened. One of the cattle was gone, dragged off by the storm, and 2 others were missing. Panic squeezed her chest. She had already lost so much. The last thing she could afford was to lose more. The sun was barely up when she saw Cole's horse riding toward her, his silhouette cutting through the mist. He didn't speak as he rode up to her. "You lost some," he said, matter of fact. "We'll find them." Nell nodded, her heart heavy. She didn't know what she was supposed to do, but Cole's calm presence gave her something to hold on to. They spent the next several hours tracking the cattle, walking through snow and deep mud. Cole led the way, his horse steady beneath him, while Nell followed closely behind, struggling to keep up. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. By the time they found the missing cattle, one was injured. Cole didn't hesitate. He roped it with expert precision, guiding it back toward the barn with a calm that Nell envied. "You should have lost more," he said softly after they'd brought the injured cow back to the barn. "But you tried." That matters. For the first time, Cole's words felt like more than just a comment. They felt like approval, like recognition of something she wasn't even sure she had. That night, she went to bed with her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't just about the cattle anymore. It was about everything. About the ranch, about Cole, about herself. She had been so sure she was going to fail. But she hadn't. Not yet. The next morning, Cole was there again, like clockwork. This time, he didn't bring supplies or help. He brought something else. Knowledge. "If you're going to make it out here," he said, his voice steady but firm, "you need to understand the land, not just the cattle. The weather, the water, the sky." The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. "You need to know when to move and when to wait." Nell didn't hesitate. She followed him, learning the way he moved through the land, the way he understood the silence between the wind and the earth. He showed her how to read the clouds, how to follow the animals, how to listen to the sounds around her. Cole's lessons were harsh, but necessary. And as the weeks passed, Nell started to feel it. The land was still unforgiving, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Then came the moment when Cole left her with something more than knowledge. He looked at her, the same unreadable look on his face. "Tomorrow," he said. "You ride with me." "Where?" Nell asked, her voice thick with uncertainty. "Roundup. Time to see if you're ready." Nell's heart beat hard against her chest. The roundup was the real test. If she could survive that, she could survive anything. She was ready. She had to be. The morning of the roundup was colder than usual, the air crisp and sharp as Nell stepped outside. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. The sun had barely risen, but she was already awake, already ready. She had been preparing for this day, whether she knew it or not, ever since she had set foot on this land. She hadn't slept much the night before. Her mind had been racing with everything that could go wrong. The cattle not responding, the fence breaking again, her hands not holding up when they needed to. She could hear Cole's voice in her head, steady and calm. "You have to be ready." Her boots sank into the wet earth as she walked toward the barn, the sky still dark overhead, a smattering of stars lingering in the cold. She could hear the faint sound of hooves as Cole's horse approached, its rider silhouetted against the pale light. "Ready?" Cole asked, his voice low, as always. Nell hesitated. She wasn't sure she could ever be ready, but the truth was, she didn't have a choice. "I have to be." she said quietly. Cole didn't speak for a long moment, his eyes focused on the cattle grazing at the far side of the pasture. "You've learned a lot." The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. "But today's different. Roundup's a test. If your cattle don't show well, they're as good as gone." Nell nodded. She had known that. But hearing it from Cole made it feel like a weight she couldn't shake. They spent the next few hours moving through the cold, gathering the cattle, pushing them toward the center of the valley. Nell's heart pounded in her chest, each step a reminder that everything she had worked for could be lost in a single mistake. The cattle were sluggish, their movements slow and hesitant, just like the land itself. Nell had never worked this hard before. Every move felt like it mattered more than the last. But with each passing moment, she began to understand. She understood the rhythm of the land, the cattle, the way the valley had its own way of doing things. By midday, the cattle were moving in a herd, slow but steady. Nell had done it. She had helped move them from pasture to pasture, keeping them together, guiding them the way Cole had taught her. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. She wasn't sure how long it would last, but for the first time since she had arrived, she felt like she had a hand in making something work. That was when the first challenge came. A storm was rolling in. The wind picked up again, cold and biting, and the sky darkened in an instant. Cole didn't flinch. He just looked at her and said, "We need to get them to shelter. Now." Nell's heart leapt in her chest as she pushed the cattle forward, struggling to keep them moving against the wind. She could feel the pressure building, the sense of urgency, and the panic that threatened to rise with each gust of cold air. But Cole was steady beside her. His horse moved with purpose, guiding the cattle, the sound of his commands cutting through the storm. Nell followed, trying to keep up with him, the weight of the storm pressing in from all sides. The sky darkened faster than she expected, and the first raindrops hit the ground like stones. The cattle began to scatter, their panic spreading faster than the storm. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. Cole's voice rang out again, louder this time. "Get them back in line. Don't let them scatter. Keep them together, Nell." She didn't think, she just moved. She grabbed the reins of her horse and pushed forward, shouting for the cattle to follow. They hesitated, but they moved. Slowly, hesitantly. The storm came down harder. The wind was relentless, biting through her coat, tearing at the fabric as she fought to keep the herd in place. Her hands were frozen, her body aching, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. For hours they worked, pushing the cattle into the barn for shelter, keeping them calm, making sure they didn't panic. The storm raged outside, but inside the barn, they were safe. Nell leaned against the wall of the barn, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her body shaking from the cold. She had never worked so hard in her life. But she had done it. She had kept them together. She had passed the test. Cole came up beside her, his face as calm as ever, despite the storm's fury outside. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. "You did good," he said, his voice low. Nell didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure what good meant. She wasn't sure if it meant she had passed, or if it was just the start of something harder. "Tomorrow's going to be worse," Cole said, wiping the rain from his brow. "The roundup isn't over yet. We'll need to get the cattle moving again at first light." Nell nodded, too exhausted to argue. She had learned this much already. There was no time to rest. They stayed in the barn until the storm subsided, keeping watch over the cattle, the air thick with the scent of wet fur and hay. The wind howled, but inside it was quiet, the kind of quiet that let Nell think. She thought about how much had changed in such a short time. She thought about Cole and the way he had always been there, even when she hadn't asked. Maybe it wasn't about just surviving anymore. Maybe it was about belonging. When the storm finally passed, the sky opened up, the first hint of daylight creeping over the horizon. It was a new day. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her, and tomorrow they would do it again. Cole didn't say much as they rode back to their ranches. But Nell didn't need words. The air between them was different now, heavier with something unspoken, something that felt like understanding. As they reached the boundary of her ranch, Cole stopped his horse and looked at her. "You're ready for tomorrow," he said, his voice quieter now, almost like a promise. Nell nodded, her heart still pounding, but steadier now. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The days after the storm blurred together in a haze of work, exhaustion, and the slow burn of something new building inside Nell. Each morning she woke before dawn, her body already aching from the day before, but there was no time to waste. The cattle had to be cared for, the fences had to be mended. The ranch had to be kept alive, even if it meant giving everything she had. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. Cole came by every day, teaching her the next steps: how to handle the cattle, how to repair fences, how to read the sky before the storm hit. He never asked for thanks, never expected anything in return, but Nell couldn't ignore the quiet way he kept showing up. He was teaching her, yes, but he was also giving her something else, something that was more than just knowledge. It was respect. The next test came with the spring roundup. The cattle had to be moved to the high pastures for grazing. It was the most critical time of the year, and if the herd wasn't handled right, it could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Cole wasn't there at first. He had his own herd to handle, his own responsibilities to take care of. But Nell wasn't alone anymore. The lessons were becoming muscle memory. Each task she completed, feeling less like a struggle and more like something she was meant to do. The morning of the roundup was bright and clear, the valley stretching wide and quiet under a pale blue sky. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. Nell saddled her horse and rode out to meet the cattle, her hands steady on the reins. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't the same panic she had felt before. She had learned to trust the rhythm of the land, the sound of hooves, the way the cattle moved when they knew they were being cared for. She moved the herd with a quiet confidence, just like Cole had shown her. The cattle followed, hesitant at first, but they trusted her now. She wasn't just another outsider. They had learned to follow her. As she rode, Nell felt something shift inside of her. The weight of the land, the burden of responsibility, had started to feel lighter. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was the beginning of something else, something that felt like a future. But then, halfway through the roundup, disaster struck. One of the cattle, a young calf, broke from the herd, running wild toward the edge of the cliff that bordered the pasture. The other cattle followed, spooked by the sudden panic, and the whole herd started to scatter. Nell's heart raced. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. She could hear Cole's voice in her head, calm and steady. "Don't panic. Move them slowly. Don't chase them." But this wasn't a slow movement. This was chaos, the kind that could ruin everything she had worked for. She pushed her horse forward, shouting for the cattle to stop, but they were panicking too much. The wind picked up again, blowing dust into the air, and the whole valley seemed to spin out of control. "Come on!" Nell shouted, her voice raw with fear. "Stay together!" It was like trying to stop a storm with nothing but words. But just as the herd began to break free, she caught sight of Cole, riding in from the other side. He didn't hesitate. He moved with purpose, cutting through the chaos with the same calm focus he had shown her so many times before. "Steady," Cole called, his voice carrying over the wind. He pulled his horse close to the herd, his movements swift and sure. Nell watched in awe as he worked, his presence enough to turn the tide. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. Together, they managed to herd the cattle back into a group, forcing them to settle down on a high pasture, away from the edge of the cliff. Nell's chest heaved, her hands trembling from the effort. She had done it. They had done it. The herd was safe. Cole rode up beside her, his horse steady beneath him. He didn't look at her, but his approval was there, unspoken in the way he didn't say anything. "Good job," he finally said, his voice softer than usual. Nell didn't know how to respond. She felt like she had just crossed some invisible line, the one between doubt and certainty. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived in Red Hollow months ago. She had earned something here. But it wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It was about something deeper. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, Cole turned to ride back to his place. But Nell stopped him with a word. "Cole," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. He turned, waiting for her to speak. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. For a moment there was only silence between them, and then Cole nodded. "You earned it," he said, his words almost like a challenge. "You've always had it in you." The air between them shifted again. It wasn't just a passing gesture anymore. Something had changed, something between them that neither of them could ignore. And for the first time, Nell didn't feel like she was standing on the edge of something. She felt like she had found her place. As she watched Cole ride away, she knew that this land, the one that had almost broken her, was now hers to claim. And it would never be the same again. The days following the roundup were filled with a kind of peace Nell hadn't felt before. The cattle grazed in the high pastures, the fences held steady against the wind, and the barn, though still creaky, felt more like a home than it ever had. Every task she completed, no matter how small, felt like a victory. But peace was fleeting. The valley had a way of reminding her that nothing was ever certain here. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. Nell worked tirelessly through the weeks that followed, her body aching in ways it had never ached before. Her muscles were scarred with the work of survival, and her hands, once delicate, were now rough with calluses. But with each passing day, she became more and more like the land she was learning to live with, tough, resilient, and unwilling to give in. It was during one of these long days, as she worked along the fence line, that she saw Cole again. His horse approached slowly, his steady gaze focused on her as he came closer. There was something different in the air now, a tension, an unspoken understanding. He had always been quiet, but today he seemed quieter than ever. "You're still here," he said when he finally spoke. It wasn't a question, but a statement, one that carried a weight Nell hadn't been prepared for. She nodded, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "I told you I wasn't leaving." Cole dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. He looked at the fence she had been repairing, the posts straight and firm, the wire taut. "You've done good," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I don't say it much, but you've done more than I thought you could." Nell didn't know how to respond. She wasn't looking for praise, but she couldn't deny the feeling that his words meant more than they ever had before. "There's a rancher's meeting in town tomorrow," Cole continued, glancing at her. "You should come." Nell froze, the weight of his words hitting her harder than expected. A rancher's meeting. It wasn't just about the cattle anymore. It was about something deeper, something she had never been part of, until now. "I don't belong there," she said quietly, unsure of herself for the first time in weeks. "You own land," Cole replied, his eyes meeting hers. "That makes you one of us." It was the first time he had said something like that. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about belonging. The thought made Nell's chest tighten. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. She had fought so hard to make this land hers, but the thought of walking into town, into the circle of men who had always been there, made her stomach churn. But Cole's gaze softened, and for the first time, Nell didn't feel like a stranger. "Come with me," Cole said simply. "You've earned it." The next day, Nell rode to town with Cole, the quiet man beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. As they arrived at the small church that served as the meeting hall, the eyes of the town were already upon them. The men looked at her as though she had walked into a room where she didn't belong. Some of them sneered, some of them nodded, a few whispered behind their hands, but no one said anything to her face. The meeting was tense, but Nell held her ground, listening quietly as the men argued over grazing rights, fence lines, and cattle prices. She wanted to speak up. She wanted to show them she wasn't afraid. But the words wouldn't come. And then, when it was time to vote on the issue of water rights, Cole spoke. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. He didn't hesitate. He stood up, his voice cutting through the room with an authority that surprised everyone. "She's earned her place here," Cole said, his eyes moving slowly over the room. and I'll cover her land. We'll handle the grazing dispute together." The room fell silent. Nell's heart pounded in her chest as she sat there, unsure of what to say or do. But the silence didn't last long. One by one, the men nodded, some reluctantly, some with respect. The vote passed, and the issue was resolved. But it wasn't the outcome that made Nell's heart swell with pride. It was the way the town looked at her afterward. Not as an outsider, not as someone who didn't belong, but as someone who had earned her place. After the meeting, Cole rode with Nell back to her ranch. As they made their way through the quiet, moonlit valley, something shifted between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, but neither of them seemed to mind. "You don't have to do that," Nell said softly, glancing at Cole. "The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. You didn't need to stand up for me." Cole's face softened, the lines of his expression deepening with something that wasn't quite a smile. "I didn't do it for you," he said quietly. "I did it because I've seen what you've done. I've seen you fight for this place. And that's worth something." Nell didn't respond. She couldn't. She was still learning what it meant to belong to this land, to this life, and maybe, just maybe, to Cole. The next morning, as she stood on the porch of her house, the sky lightening in shades of pale gold, Nell felt something shift inside of her. The land was no longer a battle. It was home, and the woman who had once feared it, who had once thought she didn't belong, now stood with a quiet understanding of what it meant to survive. Not just to survive, but to thrive. The valley had tested her. The land had tried to break her, but she had held on. She had learned what it meant to choose not just survival, but life. The man on horseback didn't say a word when he saw her. And as Cole rode up beside her, his presence steady and sure, Nell knew that this land wasn't something she had inherited. It was something she had earned. "You've earned it too," she said, her voice steady and sure. Cole glanced at her, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time, he smiled. "I think we both have," he said, and in that moment, Nell understood. This wasn't just about the land. It was about the people who fought for it, the people who chose to stay when everything said they shouldn't. And as the wind whispered through the valley, Nell knew something for certain. She wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever.